Anyway, I was talking about the geared pegs on my viola boy for the better tuning of the sympathetic strings, and I think I actually want to tune in front of you. At this point, you may actually want to walk away from your computer and get a hot chocolate or something, I don't know. Please suit yourself. So yes, as I was saying, if the idea of geared pegs doesn't appeal to you, and I'm a little bit unhappy with the ones that I put on here because they make the instrument a little bit top heavy, which is a little bit sad. There is a maker named Jonathan Hill in London who takes a traditional peg and basically he cuts the part of the shaft of the peg that's in the peg box and he replaces it with a narrower carbon fiber shaft. He tells me actually that there's a limit to how thin the shaft can be, because even the sympathetic strings, if the shaft is less than 3 millimeters, the sympathetic strings will actually break as they get tightly twisted around that very small shaft. However, that gives the player tremendously more control. The smaller that is, the more mechanical advantage the player has when he's tuning the sympathetic strings. So now, how are they tuned? Well, actually, you can have a certain amount of fun with that. So I guess at this point in my lecture, I'm pretending that you've decided you want to play the viola away, you're going to pick up a viola away. So, no, the first time you pick up a viola away, you're going to bang the peg box against the music stand. I've told people this for almost 30 years now, and they always laugh. And they pick up a viola away, and within 5 minutes, they've hit the music stand with the peg box. So know that that's going to happen, and I hope the first time you do it, you don't hit too hard. So tuning the viola away, the playing strings first. So let me see. Oh, my iPad is awake. That's great. So let's just do it. The way I don't. Hang on. Okay, I don't tune string against string like you tune a violin. I find that if I try to do it that way, I always screw up on the force. I get the force inside out and the instrument winds up not being in tune. So what I do is this. There we go. Against the other, but if you find that they don't suit, you should actually go back and find out what went wrong with tuning the D's and A's. Now, like if you're in a real live rehearsal situation, you can take it from the keyboard instrument. If you're working with multiple violas, then I recommend that you get one person in tune, and then one person gives everybody first this A, and then this D. And all of that. I just find that that's a more efficient, quicker way of tuning. With the third, you have to be a little bit careful. It won't be entirely pure, because then the first time you get into a modulation, you're going to find out that things are not working out for you. Like even if you're just playing a Vivaldi concerto in D major, when you get to the sections in B minor, if you tune that F sharp too pure, it's going to be too low for you. Okay, so that's the playing strings. That wasn't too bad. I mean, I could have done it better, and you should do it better than that, but it wasn't terrible. Now, what I do for sympathetics, let's see. So the next piece is actually going to be in minor. Now, my top string is, I'm going to tune to a B, and that's because I got tired of breaking the top string. So I just don't go all the way up to D. Well, let's tune it to a sharp form. No, actually, we're going to play a minor piece, so let's tune. Yeah. Now, when you're tuning to notes that are not the one that the company put on the outside of the string packet that they came from, you're generally good for a whole step either way, a whole tone, higher or lower. In the mid-register, sometimes you can actually get a little more than that. Personally, I find that if I try this trick with the top string, that's where going up can be an issue. Other strings that are touchy for retuning actually is the sixth string. The bottom D string, if you try to tune it up to an F, for instance, usually either you get something that's not very responsive or it breaks. So when I'm playing in the F tuning, for instance, I usually use a viola G string in that sixth string position. Let's just finish this. Let's see, the next note, I'm going to actually tune a G. And then what am I going to do? Oh, that's good. We'll get an A. Oh, a D. Even with geared pegs, there's just so many things, so many places for the sympathetic strings to turn corners. 1, 2, 3. It's got so many corners that it has to slide around that it's just never really easy to get them beautifully in tune. It needs to be done carefully and cautiously. But if you get it right, it's actually kind of fun, and I like to do that scale thing because that just gives me a way of supporting more of the harmonies of the piece than just the tonic harmony, and that's why I do that. And so I'll give you a moment now to listen to a little aria, an anonymous aria from a manuscript, a copy of which was given to me by Ludwig Hampe of Frankfurt 11 years ago when we did a lovely concert together. It's a little orphaned movement, no bass line extant, so I wrote the bass line for it. And in this one, I'm going to give you a chance to see the score the first time, I think it is, and then a facsimile, or the facsimile of the original, which is in scordatura notation. So have a little look at that, and then we'll go on. Okay, so we're going to move now to the next details of notation. So in that last one that you just saw, basically the viola d'amore is from a period where musicians were very multi-handed. And by multi-handed I mean that they played all of the instruments, or at least many of the instruments. But even in this period, the viola d'amore was a sideline. It was a special color. The skills of other instruments are called into play to create the notation for the instrument. And nowadays we call this scordatura. In this last example, the top 4 strings of the instrument are notated as if you were pretending you were playing a violin. You're holding the viola d'amore, but you're pretending you're playing the violin. But if you were very quick in noticing, you notice that the clef given was with the alto C clef. And so here we have, from the period, something like 1,000, 1,500 examples of scordatura notation for the viola d'amore using violin fingerings, but indicated with an alto clef, and I have no idea why that is. I got to ask that question a lot of times. I got nothing to say. Okay, now one other difficulty with these tunings is the piece doesn't always give you the tuning. Now there are many. In this what we're calling the scordatura approach with air quotes. Usually there's a chordatura at the beginning to tell you how to tune the instrument. And it's nice when they do that, but they don't always do that, and sometimes you actually have to figure it out from what you see in the piece. And when you have to do that, usually there are chords that make it pretty clear what the open strings are supposed to be. But just so you know, there is a large manuscript, what I call the Stockholm Sonatas, and this is what I did my BIS recording of 15 years ago now. For volume 2, I was trying out the idea that Arios's viola d'amore didn't go higher than the A string of a violin, or a B actually, a B above the A. And I did that whole recording that way, and then I had more experiments and more experience, and I became convinced that Ariosti really did tune as high as D. And so a few years ago, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, when the Gertweig manuscript was noticed, the appearance of various movements of the Ariosti Stockholm Sonatas in that manuscript proved to me that, in fact, Ariosti's viola d'amore went as high as a D double prime. Now, sometimes the source doesn't give you a tuning, and actually it doesn't matter. This is an area where I think a lot of players work their brains very hard. They have the preconception, presumption that all tunings have to be in a chord, in a triad of some sort, and so they try to figure out what that's going to be for example, the 2 arias from the John Passion of Bach. I think that actually composers have 2 different approaches to the viola d'amore. Either they've picked it up for the special tricks that it can do. For example, the partita by Bieber for 2 violas d'amore. The opening of that is, well, I'm going to play it in major, but you'll see what I mean. It's just those thirds. Now, you can do that so easily on the viola d'amore, and actually on the viola or the violin, that's already not so easy. So it's kind of the point to be able to do that easily, that you take out the viola d'amore, and that was Bieber's approach. But for the Bach-John Passion, to be honest, I think the key that you tune the instrument in and the intervals that you choose really don't matter. It's taken me a long time to get to that point. And Bach is not the only composer who chose the viola d'amore, not for its special tricks, but for its symbolism and its color, and its emotional affect. And another composer is actually Janáček, who turned to it when he wanted to write pieces that had to do with this intense infatuation he had with that young woman, Katja. So let's listen now to a second aria, and we're kind of moving on here from notation to ornamentation. So this is a lovely aria by Petzold. Petzold, you think you don't know, but in fact he wrote a couple minuets that appear in the Anna Magdalena book of Bach. And so if I played them for you, you would recognize instantly that you know a couple of works of Petzold. And so here is one for the viola d'amore in Pisandel's hand. And it's of great interest to me because this is a working copy, so most of our manuscripts that come down to us from the 18th century, even the viola d'amore manuscripts that I looked at, most of them are clean copies meant for storage in a library. But this particular one is clearly a working copy. The musicians' embellishments are all over the page. And so let's have a listen to this one now. This recording was from my first solo recording called Many Strings Attached. You can actually download that entire recording for free from my website, www.violamoy.com. Let's move on now and see if we can wrap this up. Just as you will find many people who will tell you an archback is a prerequisite for a large sound, you will always read that the viola moy was always tuned in the key of the piece that you're playing. And that is even largely true, but it's an unfortunate thing that it gets written down and said so much, because there are many interesting things that have been composed for the viola moy that lie outside of that. And I'll just mention a few of them now. So I mentioned already Henri Casadasu, and so he, yes, he played in all of the keys in D major. So it was and I could go on and on and on, because he did he did one in all of the keys. But he wasn't even the first. In about 5 years ago, it finally came to light that there's a manuscript of 26 galanteries by Josef Fuchs and Franz Goertz, or František Goertz, something like that. Franz Goertz was a composer in Erlmutz, and he was basically an exact contemporary of Mozart. He was born in 1755, and he lived a little longer than Mozart. He died in 1815, I think. And like Mozart, he worked for Colorado, but his Colorado was Colorado Waldsee, and not the Colorado in Salzburg, but the cousin of the Colorado in Salzburg. And by the way, Erlmutz is actually a place that Mozart visited when there was a smallpox epidemic on. Mozart went there to escape the smallpox epidemic, and that's where he had smallpox. Anyway, so these guys, Fuchs and Goertz, and these 26 galanteries really deserve to be better known, because all kinds of crazy things happened in them. Fuchs, for instance, will write a piece in A-flat major, and the only tone that is in A-flat is actually the lowest 7th string. That will be in A-flat, and all of the rest of them will be in D major. He also wrote a piece in E-flat minor or 2 pieces in E-flat minor for an instrument tuned in D. And that's why it's fun. It's for those pieces, which are actually the most difficult and the most sophisticated for the viola moy, where it's fun to depart from the regular tuning of the sympathetic strings, so you can support some of the other harmonies. So I'm coming to the end of this, I think. Yes, I need to mention that if all of those complexities and confusions were not enough, in the 18th century there was an entirely different operating system for the viola moy. And that's sometimes called the Darmstadt School. And in the Darmstadt School, they tuned in force, starting on a B flat, and they tuned down by force. When they got to the 6th string, which would be an A, they tuned it up half a step. So you have an instrument, kind of an alto range instrument, tuned from big B flat to B flat prime. And in that school, they tuned, they actually wrote in real notation, not in scordatura. And so you actually had to learn the instrument properly. But it would be too awkward in that tuning to play in sharp keys. So what you see is, for instance, in the Telemann Concerto in E major, the original part is in F. So the player tunes the entire instrument down a half tone and then pretends that everything is as normal. In the Böhm Concerto for oboe, viola, and bassoon, which is in G, the viola d'amore tunes up a tone, and the part is still in F. A bowed stringed instrument that is a transposing instrument. I must say, the first time I ran into these manuscripts, I could not figure out how to work my way through them. I couldn't imagine that the viola d'amore could be a transposing instrument. But when I finally figured that out with the help of period sources and other players, it made life a whole lot easier. Now, once again, it really depends on the work, whether this tuning matters or not. This fourth tuning matters very much for works like the Telemann Concerto in E, and I'll give you just a little snippet of that in manuscript here. As you see, it's in E, but the part is in F, and it's in French violin clef, and it sounds an octave lower than written. All these little quirks. Now, and Telemann being the kind of composer that he was, the part is just written brilliantly for the instrument. Everything that is strong has an open string. It's a pleasure to use. Applying this fourth tuning to things like the John Passions, however, that didn't seem to help me very much at all. I'm going to actually have to wrap this up here and try again to make a recording, because I'm getting zapped by my recorder again. Just a moment. So here I am back again for the last time, I hope, to wrap things up. It's still part 2 of the introduction to the viola d'amore for, I don't know, the 3rd time or something like that. I am already lost. So I just want to point out a few things about the viola d'amore in conclusion. So as I've said several times, there are a lot of difficulties. I haven't gone on and on about some of the other problems for the viola d'amore player. For instance, the strings are not at the local violin shop. Your repertoire is mostly not in your nearest music library. So why did the instrument survive at all? In my view, once again, we're just talking about my opinion. In my view, the instrument survives because when composers are faced with expressing the most intense emotional music moments in music, they need something that familiar instruments can't give them. Now let's go through a few examples of these. I think that Bach turned to the viola d'amore in the John Passion at the Scourging of Christ to consider what that might mean for the believer. I think he turned to the viola d'amore because that's what the intensity of the moment demanded for him. For Telemann, whose Passion was also presented by Bach and would have been known by Bach's parishioners and audience, he turned to the viola d'amore for the carrying of the cross. Another composer who lived just a short distance away, Stürzel, turned to it in his Passion for the episode about the crown of thorns. In other centuries, I've already mentioned, I think that Janacek turned to the viola d'amore to express the emotion over his intense infatuation with that young woman. Bernard Herrmann turned to it for a twilight episode in which a young child is suddenly and inexplicably disappears. It's gone completely. This is an episode, I think from 1962 or so. It's called Little Girl Lost, and it is viola d'amore solo throughout, accompanied by 4 flutes and 4 harps and percussion. These moments of intense emotion, where something very special is called for, I think those are what has kept the viola d'amore going. And what's more, I think it's in no danger of disappearing. Thank you for listening to my introduction to the viola d'amore. I hope I've answered your questions. I'll post this on my YouTube channel. If you have more questions, I'd be interested to hear them. Put them in the comments. And thanks for listening.